Welcome everyone to the Klingspor Museum in Offenbach, Germany. We meet digitally today, and that opens the possibility for me to really show you around the museum and the archive while talking of a very important person for German type design in the 20th century. As you already know, I'm talking about Rudolf Koch today, who said of himself that the making of letters in any form is my purest and greatest pleasure. I will talk about Koch's work for the type foundry Gebrüder Brothers Klingspor here in Offenbach and about his very rich artistic life. By coincidence, we also host an exhibition about the Klingspor Type Archive at the moment, connected with new ideas to use the designs of Rudolf Koch and other designers of Klingspor in contemporary type design. So you will also get the chance to visit the show digitally with me today, and I can actually touch and show the archive materials I'm talking about. So maybe this digital meeting isn't so bad after all. I hope my English is understandable. Last time I had a talk in English, I generated some amusement about the pronunciation of the word dandelion that I pronounced dandelion. So you might have some extra fun with me as well. I'm standing in our library at the moment, which is also our archive. The Klingspor Museum collects modern and contemporary book and type art. This means a lot of different things: artists' books, illustrated books, children's books, tapestries, calligraphy, type design, communication design, posters, and so on, beginning in the year 1900. We take care of about 80,000 pieces, and a very important collection includes the type designs by the type foundry Klingspor, until 1906 known as Ruthardsche Schriftgießerei, type foundry of Ruthard. The type foundry suffered huge damage in World War II, so a great amount of archive materials has been destroyed, but we still have a decent collection of type specimens and process material we can work with. And of course, the collection still grows from different private sources. Rudolf Koch joined the type foundry in 1906 and worked there till the end of his life in 1934. He became the most important type designer of the business, developing over 20 fonts for printing in several variables during the many years of his employment. These fonts are listed chronologically. So you see the priority of black letter fonts in the beginning of Koch's career and the especially wide range of variables of the typeface Kabel in the 1920s, in light, regular and bold weights, and in italic versions as well. In almost 20 years of designing type for Klingspor, Rudolf Koch has developed a wide range of artistic styles and approaches to type design. I will show some examples later on. And all of his designs and also his artistic and crafted works are somehow connected to the ideas and tendencies of the society Rudolf Koch lived in. I have the impression that Rudolf Koch's oeuvre reacts very specifically to the spirit and the ideas of his time. His works are crafted by his personal ideas, but also transport the historical surroundings, and therefore they can be seen as a source to understand the person Rudolf Koch on the one hand, and on the other hand, the time he was living in. Rudolf Koch was exposed to some strong influences in his life. He was a deeply religious Protestant. He shared the patriotic ideas of his time. He fought as a soldier in the Great War, and he was a really curious and gifted craftsman. He of course designed typefaces, but he also made other things. He, for example, made book designs like the Blumenbuch from the 1920s, huge calligraphies like this one from the Sermon on the Mount. Drawings, for example, of his family in the War Winter 1918. He made metal works. This one is very, very heavy, so I need Simon to help with. Oh my goodness. Magst du es da hinstellen? Okay. Okay, this is a vessel to contain the consecrated bread used in the service of the Holy Communion. Then he also made several very, very strong woodcuts after his wartime. And he even made tapestries. So this is your turn as well. Another time, Simon. This one is the first tapestry Rudolf Koch made by himself. It's from the year 1922. And for this one, he even dyed the yarn according to old recipes. This tapestry we bought in 2016 from private property, and it's really interesting to visualize the arrangement of words from the Gospel of John Rudolf Koch chose. In German it would be: In der Welt habt ihr Angst, aber seid getrost, ich habe die Welt überwunden. In English it's something like: In the world you are afraid, but be confident, I have overcome the world. And Rudolf Koch chose two words, Trost and Wunden, for very central parts in this tapestry. These words mean consolation and wound in English. So I have the impression that these are very characteristic terms for Rudolf Koch's work and also his life. So I guess we can summarize: Rudolf Koch was interested in all kinds of crafts, in doing things by hand, and he always wanted to pass on his skills to others. The type foundry Gebrüder Klingspor in Offenbach had become known around 1900 for publishing Art Nouveau typefaces. One of the owners, Karl Klingspor, wanted type design to be regarded as artistic work and entrusted artists such as Otto Eckmann, Peter Behrens with the design of typefaces for letterpress printing. In 1906, he also hired Rudolf Koch, who had not really had much contact with type design until then, but who had the unspecific idea of bringing a new clarity and softness to the hard and squiggly black letter fonts of the 19th century. We can witness the work of Rudolf Koch and his colleagues in the type foundry in some very delicate silhouettes he had made as a Christmas keepsake for the clients of Karl and Wilhelm Klingspor. It was issued in 1918, right after the end of the Great War, and we see, for example, Rudolf Koch himself showing one of his proofs to Karl Klingspor. Koch is standing there in his work coat and his apron, listening to Klingspor's opinion. The silhouettes demonstrate Koch's keen eye for details and for the human figure. He always managed to show people in their absorption and concentration for the tasks at hand. There we can see the actual type foundry. The lead for the letters had to be molded and then founded, at first by hand, and in the second instance by machines. Rudolf Koch describes the heat and the spluttering melted metal. Two silhouettes in this series are dedicated to the fonts Roman, Antiqua, and black letter, Fraktur. The Roman, Antiqua font is described as serial and classical, represented by Athena, the goddess of writing. The black letter, on the other hand, is represented by a woman with a basket surrounded by furs. We see the typical German wood, and the silhouette reminds me of Little Red Riding Hood in German fairy tale books. Rudolf Koch describes the black letter as beautiful German script that is already loved for a very long time, a script that reminds of the dark furs and the delicate meadow grass at the same time. Rudolf Koch has always loved and defended the black letter type that he depicted as traditionally German, which is actually not true, but nevertheless the first typeface Rudolf Koch designed for the type foundry Klingspor was also a black letter font. The first Koch type is also called Deutsche Schrift, German font, and was published in 1910. And with this, we also dive deeply in the entanglements of German history in the 20th century that can also be read in the font designs by Rudolf Koch. Today, we still look with some unease at the black letter typeface of the 20th century because they still remind us of a nationalistic spirit, maybe, that also manifested itself in these typeface designs, and we all know where this led to in the 1930s and 1940s. But we need to look closely at Rudolf Koch and his thoughts in 1910 and his design process to understand it properly. We are located in our special exhibition room right now. We show an exhibition called Beyond the Archive, from the Klingspor type foundry to the Klingspor archive, and we try to shed some light on the work of the type foundry and the historical surroundings. I told you a lot about Rudolf Koch and his work at the type foundry, and Koch was very interested in medieval book arts and was intensely aware of the developments of the arts and crafts movement in England. So this is a point where we start in this exhibition too. Koch was entangled with the ideas of William Morris and Edward Johnston, who attributed a style-forming significance to writing and type with an impact on society. So these are very important ideas for Karl Klingspor and the type foundry in Offenbach as well. In 1905, Rudolf Koch had already experimented with type design. He had the idea to develop a new kind of type by studying old types and forming their characters by using a broad-edged pen. So the forms would be smoother, more organic maybe. With Karl Klingspor, Rudolf Koch had found someone in the foundry business who also developed the idea to see typography and type design as a creative and artistic process. In 1910, Koch wrote an article in Zeitschrift für Bücherfreunde, Journal for Book Lovers, about handwritten books, in which he presented writing as an independent and self-sufficient means of artistic expression. Koch developed his first font for Klingspor, Deutsche Schrift, German font, of 1910 within years, beginning with handwriting. So the manuscript of Gospel of John by Rudolf Koch from 1908 already shows some characteristics of this typeface that was already developing at that time. Rudolf Koch describes that he worked long and laboriously using a broad quill pen to develop a type style which pays justice to this tool and is otherwise in all respects as simple and pure as possible. And you can of course see his love for medieval book design. The characters are, at first sight, a mixture of very classical Gothic and Schwabacher alphabets, but without their geometrical regularity. It's actually a very lively and almost playful font with dynamic strokes, but also established enough to fulfill different kinds of necessities in using it. Fritz Korge writes in 1911 about Koch's Deutsche Schrift. This new typeface is strong and distinctive, free and lively. It comes to us, sits down, and with a cheerful glance and a wide smile says, "My name is Koch. I feel very comfortable here." And Korge sees larger works like the Nibelungen, Gudrun's Song, the Four Gospels set in Koch type, and in his opinion, a signal is given by this type for a Bible to be printed, which will be perceived by living and future generations. Type for the language of Luther, the prose of Lessing, Gottsched, and Fichte. Fritz Korge describes the new typeface as strong and distinctive on the one hand, free and lively on the other hand, a blend of a kind of conservative steadiness that reminds of German type history and of a new spirit of freedom and liberation within the old boundaries. It's quite interesting that Korge refers to Nibelungen, Gudrun's Song, Martin Luther, Lessing and Gottsched, all these very German identity-establishing authors and literature. When we have a look at the type specimen, we also see these connections in the words chosen. The words mean huntsman, for example, building or structure, Berthe, and the German town of Dresden. In the Wilhelmine Germany, a quite conservative patriotic spirit rose that was widespread throughout German society. The quite young German nation searched for some national identity, so Rudolf Koch had, as most Germans, a strong love for his home country and its historical achievements he wanted to preserve and to defend. Koch's black letter is also a symbol of the patriotic idea and its stabilization in Germany at that time. The Time Foundry even calls this typeface Deutsche Schrift, an incarnation of German spirit in type design. So with this design, Koch acts at the pulse of the time, and the Deutsche Schrift, or also called Koch type, was therefore a great success for the Type Foundry. Even though a broad discussion among type designers and printers also took place in these days about the use of Antiqua or black letter, but this would be a huge other topic. Handwriting was a part of Koch's daily work, and the appropriation of a text in writing by hand also fascinated him privately. Thus, there is a large number of handwritten books. He lists 103 himself and calligraphies by Koch. Some of them are still in the museum's archive today. And most of Koch's typefaces for Klingspor have developed from handwriting, and there's always a connection between his private involvement with type and his designs for Klingspor. This connection becomes very, very obvious a few years later in a manuscript for Koch's friend Siegfried Guggenheim. It is a codex with the text Handbook of Judaism, Principles of Jewish Moral Teaching, which Koch produced in 1914 for his friend Siegfried Guggenheim. Siegfried Guggenheim was a Jewish lawyer who lived and worked in Offenbach, and Guggenheim was not just a very close friend, he was also a patron of Rudolf Koch's art. The Handbook of Judaism is an exceptionally beautiful book, with a binding from white leather, written on parchment in a fragile, most tactile black letter. It fascinates through the lightness and delicacy of its handwriting, corresponding with the tendril ornamentation in blue, red, green and golden hues that Koch generously dispersed across the pages. The work is clearly influenced by the flowery tendrils in late Gothic book illumination. In the late Gothic period, especially in books of hours, we find the beginning of detailed floral depiction, and Koch proves one more time his sure instinct to link some historically gained mastership with new ideas to look at type design. In 1914, the type foundry Klingspor also issued a new Koch typeface called Frühling, Spring, that reminds strongly of the light calligraphy he chose for the Handbook of Judaism. Koch describes strong upstrokes and downstrokes and large capital letters give it an appearance of lightness. The lively gentleness and gracefulness are what makes it special. Printed carefully on very white paper, composed loosely and open, it can be used anytime one is looking to create an elegant effect and seeking delicate restraint. Even though Koch was a type designer at first hand, he always had in mind the artistic synthesis of type design, typography, material and illustration. Koch's increasingly notable work for the Klingspor Type Foundry was interrupted in 1914 by the outbreak of the Great War. In August 1915, Rudolf Koch joined the army. He was 38 years old, and had a large family, as we can see in his drawings and scissor cuts of these days. From 1911 till 1915, Rudolf Koch cut an ingenious series of silhouettes from thin black paper. Rudolf Koch calls them Schattenbilder, shadow pictures maybe. In a silhouette of 1912, he presents a quite private view into his family life. We see Rudolf Koch playing the guitar, his wife Rosa with their youngest daughter Lore sitting on her lap, the oldest son Paul, 6 years old, playing with his railway set under the table, and the two daughters Margarete and Ursula. Koch shows a very lively depiction of his everyday family life. One can almost hear the children talking and playing, and the peacefulness of the scene is touching. You can also see Koch's deep religiousness in this cutting. Above the picture it says, Selig sind die reinen Herzens sind, denn sie werden Gott schauen. Blessed are the pure-hearted ones, they will witness God. Koch's Christianity was alive and undogmatic and closely linked to his life and his work, which we will see later on. There are other memories of the family that Koch clearly wanted to preserve. In this silhouette from 1911, he visualizes a day in September 1911, when his daughter Ursula had her first pigtail. These documentations show Rudolf Koch's ability to perceive the small things in life and his desire to preserve these memories. The cuttings were not originally meant to be published. It was some kind of private activity and a way to establish a personal culture of remembrance. In 1934, Ernst Kellner writes about the silhouettes. During the quiet hours on a restful Sunday, the master captured these scenes of his domestic life for his own pleasure and only for himself and his family. They were only published when he gained a considerable emotional distance from his early work because of the intervening experience of having served 3 years at the front during the war. Indeed, the 28 silhouettes Koch had made were first published in 1918 in a limited edition of 150 copies. In February 1915, the political situation enters the scissor cuts. This picture illustrates the patriotic but still civilian Rudolf Koch carrying a flagpole out of the door. The headline says "Wieder 50.000 Russen," which means another 50,000 Russians, which can be seen as a comment on the war reporting of these days. So Rudolf Koch, of course, pursued the political developments with a patriotic spirit we already know he shared, and in August 1915 he joined the army. Several German artists and intellectuals perceived the Great War as a purifying event, a chance for a fresh start in politics, and also Rudolf Koch felt the urge to support his country. By the time Rudolf Koch joined the war in August 1915, about 1 million soldiers had already died at the front line. He writes, "During the war, I became a soldier in Berlin and was sent to Serbia from October 1915, France from February 1916, and Russia from July 1917. Always with the fighting troops and always as a common soldier. What I gained in experience by this period of my life is not to be expressed in words, but careful observer of my work will notice the change that this period brought about in me." It is important to keep these words in mind. Rudolf Koch constantly recorded his experiences in war. I found, one can read in his report, when I emerged from this misery, that I had developed a strong and stable feeling of self-assurance, a stronger confidence in myself, and a joyful hope for the future. He wrote letters to his friends and family, some are still in the museum's collection, and he wrote a diary in retrospect 1918, which was published by the Insel Publishing House shortly after his death in 1934. In his letters and in the war report, Rudolf Koch tries constantly to reassure himself and his family of the positive side effects the war might have on him. But his work after the war also suggests otherwise. Rudolf Koch made 195 drawings at the front line. He kept them in his home after the war, but within time these drawings were forgotten, till in 2014 a letter reached the Klingspor Museum in which Dr. Meyer reports of a collection of drawings made by Rudolf Koch in his possession. He inherited the drawings from his aunt Brigitte Meyer, who had died in 2011 and has obviously been a close friend of Koch's youngest daughter Lore. Lore Koch and Brigitte Meyer must have met as young women. Brigitte Meyer became deacon of the Church of Christ in Mannheim, where Lore Koch lived from the Second World War till the end of her life in 1986. You might imagine our astonishment about these lost war memories of Rudolf Koch, and the museum managed to acquire the 195 drawings with the help of the Marschner Foundation in Offenbach in 2014. So the drawings were a real sensation for us, and we got a new picture of Rudolf Koch's years in the war from them. We have the published memories of Rudolf Koch's time as a soldier, and the drawings are all dated, therefore it is quite easy to assign the drawings to the historical events and to the places Rudolf Koch has been. And the drawings seem to be some kind of diary in pictures. He usually made a sketch every other day. The sketches are depicted on very thin, poor paper. Sometimes it's a so-called Feldpostbrief, the stationery of the soldiers. So he just took every material he could get to draw with different kind of pencils, and it is quite interesting to see what he chose as motifs. We see everyday life in the barracks and on the march. We see the comrades packing and cooking and waiting. We see details of his surroundings, buildings and landscapes, flowers and plants, the view over the trench. We see his comrades, and sometimes we feel some kind of sadness maybe, and loneliness. The awareness of death and the vulnerability of life. But we never see the cruelty of war. We never really see death. We never see violation, and we know that Rudolf Koch witnessed battles, saw people dying, and might have killed people himself. He reports these things in his war memories. The text is full of details of gruesome battles, of comradeship, of hunger, yet there is some kind of artificial distance he might have gained while writing, and we don't witness these memories in his drawings. On the 5th of July 1917, he writes in his memories, "I've read of a painter who stays at the front line to draw the war. I couldn't do that. Either I'm in as a soldier who bears all the burdens and hazards, or I'm out. As spectator, as audience of the agony of my fellows, I couldn't face up any soldier anymore." Rudolf Koch is convinced of the duty he had to do for his comrades and his country, and he is convinced the things he had to endure are a divine task for him. Rudolf Koch completely resigned himself to his fate, and his religious feelings were strengthening, so all he was supposed to do was record the places he has been to and the comrades he knew as a kind of reminder, but not a critical one. The drawings have initially been made for his family to see where the husband, the father, has been all these months, and I have the impression that the motives of the drawings are chosen to tell a personal historical story. A memory he designs for himself and for his family, a bearable memory of the given task. The drawings show a restrained documentation. They are safe memories, and only after war, back home in Offenbach, there is a sudden force and violence in Rudolf Koch's work that surprises. In winter 1917, his army service ended with a medical discharge, and he returned to work at the type foundry Klingspor in February 1918. In 1919, his creative life became busier than ever, and among other things, he started to realize biblical texts in woodcuts. He became a leadership member in the congregation of his church, and his uncommissioned work focused on the Christian message. From 1919 on, Koch frequently turned to the Pre-Gutenberg practice of the Einblattholzschnitt in German, a technique on cutting illustration and lettering from one piece of wood. He wanted that, according to the prophets, something must tremble and be alive in his lettering and characters, and the woodcuts generate a forceful and lively impression. The pages of Elia from 1919 show a very dynamic, almost expressionistic style in the lettering and in the illustration. We see Elia almost blinded by the force of the divine presence. The text tells the story of Elia waiting for God. Elia covers his head to face God, and Rudolf Koch shapes him in this humble position. But I also see fear, the need to protect himself against the hazard and the storm outside. Rudolf Koch is always very sensitive in drawing human bodies and showing the emotional condition this person might be in. This Elia is somebody who surrenders to a greater force and endures pain to meet God, a situation that Rudolf Koch describes in his wartime experiences. There might be some feelings of despair and fear in these woodcuts that Koch couldn't express in his wartime drawings, but they still move him nevertheless. In 1920, he expresses these feelings not just in the torn lettering of the woodcuts, but also in the words he chose. Was hülfe es den Menschen, so er die ganze Welt gewönne und nähme doch Schaden an seiner Seele? What does it profit a man to win over the whole world when damaging his own soul? Not just the lettering seems torn, there are also conflicting emotions in the craftsman who strives to see the war and his experiences as a God-given task, but is not able to blind out the cruelty and the personal damage that happened to him and many other people. Unfortunately undated are two very strong examples of Rudolf Koch's writing of crosses he started in the early 1920s. His private works of these years are distinguished by very deep religious feelings that show in the texts he writes, but also in their unusually experimental expressiveness in writing. Rudolf Koch actually regards himself as a craftsman and is therefore not interested in expressing his own feelings in his work as an artist would do. But the woodcuts and the crosses of these years show nevertheless an inner turmoil Rudolf Koch tries to soothe with his faith. The word which is written over and over again in this cross is the word sin, and it's the first time I know of that he leaves the steadiness of the line while writing. A second cross is filled with specific sins like rage, murder, envy, taunt, superstition, vanity, adultery, and so on. The form of the cross stays very strong, but the words are fluttering and trembling inside. The cross form encloses these words, keeps them still. The emotional distress of Koch, sealed in by his faith, shows in these very touching pages. Writing, form, and emotional content correlate more and more in the later works of Rudolf Koch, and he developed the most expressive style of his career in the years right after the war. In the months of 1920 and Easter 1921, Koch produced even more impressive and time-consuming works than ever. In these busy days, he writes the 4 Gospels and the introduction to the Gospel of John by hand, each in different style, adding colored initials. Relating to the Gospel of Matthew, Gerald Cinnamon describes, his desire to give expression to his own inner impulses resulted in the creation of lively characters, often spaced closely together, forming a strong dark mass, and propelled him to seek new challenges. It should come as no surprise that the direct aspects of usefulness and readability were totally disregarded in most of these works. All aspects of the lettering had to be examined in terms of expressiveness, and for this purpose it was necessary to turn the forms of the different characters into a rich decorative creation. Completely different is the introduction to the Gospel of John, in a bold style using Roman letters and some kind of spherically otherworldly coloring in shades of blue and green. This style may be prepared Koch's first constructed geometrical typeface called Kabel, released in 1927. In 1927 was also released Paul Renner's Futura, and Koch had previously always derived his typefaces from his own writing or handicraft. And the typeface Kabel he constructed on the basis of line and circle, which can be inscribed in a square. In the 1920s, the influence of the Bauhaus had led to a strong formalization of design. Objectivity and practicality were defining design criteria that the Klingspor Company and Rudolf Koch would not escape. In 1931, Rudolf Koch explained himself in a letter to Julius Rodenberg as follows: "The task of doing a piece of writing with compass and ruler was most tempting to me, because my lively involvement in the written form otherwise always leads to very personal formulations, and I now hope to be completely free of mine for once." And yet there are unconventional design features in the Kabel that give it a stronger dynamic and individuality than its related sans serif typefaces. Marc Schütz is a contemporary type designer who created a new digital version of this font, and he describes the design of the Leitkabel as follows: "The Leitkabel has a clear rhythm, very different wide letter forms, and unconventional slanted endings of the strokes." Rudolf Koch thus combined peculiarities of calligraphy with geometry, which blended into a very idiosyncratic style that made Kabel less successful than the typeface Futura, for example. Now you have gained many insights into our archives and into the work and life of Rudolf Koch, whose work was always so connected to his personal life. And I think it's always fascinating to connect design ideas to history and to human beings and their thoughts and feelings. As a museum, we cannot rest on simply storing these design ideas and archive materials. We must also learn to put them to current use and ask new questions about them. For some years now, we have had a close cooperation with the neighboring University of Design. We cooperate in the so-called Klingspor Institute for Type Design. And our archive materials on the Klingspor Type Foundry, and thus also Rudolf Koch, of course, are repeatedly used as material for the discussions of young students who are engaged in contemporary type design. I already mentioned Marc Schütz and his redesign of Kabel. Various publications of the museum are set in it today. For example, our new catalogue about Rudolf Koch. And two graduates of the Klingspor Institute, called Laura Brunner and Leonie Martin, have also designed a website which is intended to prepare the digitization of the Klingspor Type Archive. And in fact, we are just in the final stages of completing the archive digitization in the first version and going online very soon, hopefully. We are convinced that the type designs and process materials from the past form a great treasure of possibilities for research and own design ideas. From digitization, we expect a greater awareness of our holdings and also a greater exchange with people who work with them. Here in Offenbach alone, numerous drafts of new font designs have been created in the meantime that are based on Koch typefaces, such as Kabel Neu, you already heard of it, but also the typeface of the Klingspor Institute and the typeface for archive digitization, which is based on the Koch Antiqua and is in active use here today. Gerald Zinnemann writes in the foreword to his publication about Koch. Koch looked back in history to find a new path forward, to begin again. And so we too try to keep Rudolf Koch's design ideas alive, as well as those of other type designers from the Type Foundry Klingspor. And we wish that new inspiration for the future will arise from the past. Therefore, it is important to also take a critical look at Rudolf Koch and his time, which prepared the worst internal developments in Germany. Typeface always conveys a zeitgeist and some inner ideas of a society, which is exciting to keep in mind and which perhaps explains the fascination that a young generation still has for fonts and type design. We are experiencing a not too large but all the more agile community of type designers, today often women as well, which we would like to be part of, and our archive materials are an offer we can make. So, thank you very much for listening and visiting the museum with me. I hope you enjoyed what you've seen and you enjoyed the digital time with me. Goodbye.